Mr. Feldman, it's a real pleasure to have you in California, and I hope that you find it a pleasure too. And it's a pleasure to talk to you because you've been a composer who has been, well, you've always made life more hopeful for me than other composers, and largely because of something that I think John Cage wrote in Silence. He said that when he first met you, you brought him a piece, and he said, "This is beautiful. How did you make it?" And you said that you didn't know, and he said, "How marvelous. He doesn't remember how he made it, and it's so beautiful." Did this really happen?
Yes, it did.
And what piece was that?
It doesn't exist. I threw it out.
You threw it away. Do you remember why?
I don't know. It was like the opening of the Berg Violin Concerto.
Oh, well, then I can understand how you might not have known how you made it. I assumed that he was talking about something like one of the projections.
No, the whole piece, in a sense, was... it wasn't felt... I mean, it was an early piece, and I wasn't happy with it.
How old were you then?
I wrote the piece when I was about 22, 21.
So would you say that you got off to sort of a late start composing, or...
I matured at 24.
At 24, on Tuesday.
I was a late starter.
A lot's been said, and principally by Cage, about the Cage-Feldman Wolf and Brown, I guess,
yes,
school.
Definitely.
In New York. And some people who talk about this think of it as a Cage school with sycophants, and other people who talk about it think of it as a well-worked-out sort of, quadrivirate of four, really individuals who are working at sort of separate problems in a more or less shared manner, with shared attitudes, let's say.
Well, what would Jackson Pollock and Rothko have in common?
Well, this, I suppose, is really the question. What, for example, do Cage and Wolf have in common?
Yes.
And even what does Wolf and Wolf have in common? Because, one Wolf score will be considerably different from another. And yet when you listen to them, you can certainly identify Christian Wolf's music.
Yes. No, we were absolutely different. But I think that the big impetus that the Karl Marx of our inspiration was sound.
And his prophet? Did he have one?
And we took it from there. I think that's the name of a Earl Brown piece, From Here.
You say sound, but silence has to be included too.
Oh, silent was just a question of how we breathed as individuals. Oh, silence was taken for granted.
I don't know Earl Brown's music very well, and I know Christian Wolf's music not much better, but it strikes me that Cage's music tends to be either absorbed in what it's doing or else quite nervous. That Wolf's music seems to be more or less reflective and to a certain extent intellectual, while your music seems to me to be really breathing more than anything else. Does this seem an adequate description?
I think that's very fine. In fact, speaking of Christian Wolf's music as being intellectual, let's say it's intellectual insofar as that it's not hidden. And,
yeah.
And in this sense, I always think of Christian as being the Webern of the future.
He's sort of, his music, a lot of his music is something like refined cartridge music. Refined to the point that the instructions are very clear and sometimes almost elegant. His music, in other words, is more staged than performed, but not staged anywhere near in the same sense that Cage's music is.
Yes.
Whereas your music isn't, it seems to me, staged at all. It's really more concerned with sound than it is with procedure.
Yes, I feel that I was closest to Karl Marx. Not that they're revisionists.
I have sort of been thinking in the direction that the difference that I guess 1948 or 49 has made, or the new school has made, or whatever you want to call the fence, is that before then classical music was concerned with a sort of germinal construction, taking something and building something out of it, building maybe an elaborate construct sort of thing out of it, whereas afterward and now people seem to be more concerned with passing time.
Yes.
In other words, they're more...
I was talking about this just last night with a friend, and he was asking me the difference in the painting and in the music. And I said that you could actually catch the change of the era, where with the new stuff, there became a less anxiety about time itself. So I think where someone like Stockhausen has great anxiety about what he does with his time, a kind of historical anxiety. You see, Cage doesn't have anxiety.
Is it fair to generalize and say that to a great extent this is the difference between an Eastern and a Western way of thinking about things in general? I mean, sooner or later the question of Zen is going to come
Eastern, New York, or
No.
Tokyo?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think it's a question, for example, I know in painting things changed when the painter when he could take his brush off the canvas.
Actually, this is as Western and European an idea as Mallarmé is, and as Marcel Duchamp is.
I think so. I don't think it has anything to do with Zen.
Yeah.
Whatsoever. But I think this anxiety and about time and the need to, that great W.C. Fields remarks, let's get the, let's get the cow by the tail and face the situation.
Yeah.
I always thought of tradition as getting the cow by the tail. Anyway, for me that's a very significant difference.
Well, it seems to me that it implies a different attitude toward justifying what you're doing. It seems to me that as long as a painter is terribly concerned about staying on the canvas and within the edges, and as long as a composer is terribly concerned about justifying what he's doing,
his continuity,
in terms of sort of a teleological attitude of working
exactly.
from something to something, that this, taken at its extreme, can almost be a psychosis.
I feel it was tending toward that.
And I think possibly Schoenberg was, hopefully the logical end of this tendency. Because even when he decided he was going to get out of out of tonality, he did it in the same procedure.
And remember that he was very happy. And he said that he was happy because he was extending Germanic musical tradition for another 100 years, unquote.
Yeah, and staying with the same forms, the same rhythms, and all of this business. I wonder how he really felt about Webern. I wonder how he really felt about, about the cantatas and the variations for orchestra and things of that sort. It must have been difficult for him. This doesn't put certain American academic, international-style composers in a very hopeful situation, does it?
If I just could skip back and then get back to what you just said, what he might have thought about Webern. I think that the European mind, say for example what Messiaen told the Zanakis, he said you could do anything as long as you could justify it logically, you see. And I think being that Webern did justify what he did so logically gave Schoenberg a sense of relief.
Of course, Webern is a very ambiguous figure, because you can look at his music in a completely Schenkerian way if you want to, although I can't imagine wanting to. on the one hand, it's terribly involved and terribly logical and precise, but all you have to do is just sort of turn that function of your mind off, and Webern can be completely ad libitum.
Well, that was the whole situation in the early 50s. Don't forget that the whole Cage orphan asylum went through, meaning Christian Wolf and myself and Earl, went through the Webern experience as well as a Milton Babbitt or a Boulez or Stockhausen.
What's the difference then?
Well, that's what, as you were saying before, we turned it upside down. I mean, we saw something else.
Well, no, there is somebody in the audience at this point who always says, well, you obviously you did, and obviously the reason for that is it makes life much easier for you. You don't have to think so much.
We thought more.
You can observe the imperfections in the paper instead of taking your inspiration from, I don't know.
The imperfections of other masterpieces.
Right, precisely. In other words, it all comes down to imperfections, and whether these are to be considered in a moral light or in simply, the cold light of the observing eye, with no moral imputation at all.
It's very interesting. Why was the moral road always such a conceptual one?
Well, I suppose because it's the only road that we
and
can deal with.
And perception was left to the dilettante.
That's true, isn't it? And then there are always some of these great figures in the past who were both a dilettante who could perceive and also intellectual or clever enough to come up with some kind of generalized results. And I'm thinking of people like Lawrence Stern and, maybe Shakespeare and, maybe Mozart, even late Mozart, who somehow, in almost a childlike, naive fashion, Shakespeare accepted, could travel both of these roads, could see the stones for what they were and could also see the people who were stumbling over them for what they were, and nevertheless able to do their work. But this gets off into a whole philosophical business that probably won't go much of any place. But, what do you do with the people who say, like Robert Frost, that they're not interested in playing tennis with a net down?
You mean his reference to free
birds? Yeah.
I never really thought of any kind of final solution for these fellows. I mean, I don't think about it, actually.
I suppose they're just...
they're the kibitzes. I mean, I don't...
And you don't play chess with them. You just let them watch.
It was always those fellas, in a sense, throughout history that were the ones that began to consolidate and add and take what they need, from history. I always thought it was very charming when T.S. Eliot says you use or take from history what you need. I once said to a friend, but why do they need so much?
Particularly T.S. Eliot.
It was kind of remarked as if here I'm this really independent figure.
Are you speaking against eclecticism?
No, I'm saying how they don't want to play with the net down, but little by little they found ways of playing the net down game with the net up.
Written out chance music.
Exactly. You said it, not me.
Which reminds me that while I was trying to figure out some way of dealing with the problem of Pierre Boulez, I was reading back issues of Perspectives of New Music, and somebody had an article on, I guess it was on the recording of your music on Time Records, durations. No, it was a Columbia album. It was Projections. And so what they did was simply write out the performances that they heard and then discuss them. Of course, this is all very well if they want to analyze a performance, but it doesn't really have all that much to do with the music, it seems to me. I mean, with the composition. Do you agree with Cage when he says composition's one thing, performance another, and hearing a third? What do the three have to do with one another?
No, I don't. I try to make composition one thing.
including the
Yes.
other two aspects.
Yes.
Well, let's see.
That's why I'm less oriented to the concert hall than John is. In fact, if anything...
Well, he's a performer.
Yes.
And you're a composer, then, you say?
Which one is a dirty word?
Oh, I like them both.
Then I'm the composer.
I find it easier to understand composers because performers, well, let's not go into that.
Yes, but they're great. I mean, this is another age of great composer performers. I would say that that there is a kind of marvelous, brilliant balance between the both, as, for example, in Stockhausen's music.
Momenta is sort of the point at which composition and performance and even the audience's function
Exactly.
really come together.
And when Boulez conducts his own music, now there is that aspect.
Or even sometimes other people's music. I even heard a performance of Zeitmasse that was beautiful, and when that piece can be made beautiful, you've got somebody who's composing it and conducting it at the same time.
And then the more flashier, Hollywoodish types of talents, like Luciano Berio and Lucas Foss, is all performance.
That's true.
Almost in the Cajun sense.
Although I do think that in the one case, there's more behind the performance than in the other. I mean, it seems to me that Foss is much more performance-oriented than
Berio. Yes.
Well, it seems to me, by the way, that some of these attitudes, speaking particularly about Boulez and Stockhausen, who over the years have come to be more and more identified with performance as well as with composition, it seems to me that, and this may be a coincidence, that their composition has changed considerably. Boulez gave up the total serialization, and so did Stockhausen.
Yes, they got involved with the realities of performance.
Yeah.
But, you see, I didn't. So maybe I'll arrive at total serialization eventually.
Do you think it unlikely? Do you think it as unlikely as I do?
I don't mean it as a joke.
Really? This would be just about the first case of anybody... Well, no, of course there's always Stravinsky, but that was earlier. This would be just about the first case of anybody reversing that particular road. Most of the people I've talked to seem to think that total serialization was a historical necessity at one point, but was simply not viable in the long run.
How could it... it's a very interesting thing. This whole business of historical necessity comes around only because there's very little alternative. Right.
So that you can say that Mount Everest is a historical necessity.
Exactly, there's very little alternative. But to me, once you walk up Mount Everest, or once you go through an entertainment music with all the new alternatives, what's wrong with the total serialization of these alternatives?
Well, then what's wrong with writing a piece in E major?
That's another story.
Even a sonata allegro in E major. Why is that a different story?
Because that really had it, I think.
It was bled pretty white. And yet it seems to me that there were...
I wouldn't mind a piece in E major, but they're just not happy with just staying in that E major.
Well, I meant more in the Mahler sense than in the Schubert sense, let's say, I don't know that it was completely exhaustive.
Maybe everything is in E major.
Well, the reason I said E major is because lately to me everything has sounded like E major, it's true.
I know in one of the pieces which you're probably going to play in connection with this interview, a new piece with 3 pianos. As I was writing these sounds, they became so thick that as I went from one sound to another, it had the feeling of a 5-1, 5-1, 5-1, 5-1, regardless of what the sound was. I was making a gesture of a 5-1, 5-1. Everything seemed... I actually felt I was working the way I did when I was 14 years old.
Well, this is a terrible problem because it seems to me it stems from the fact that there is a gesture, which in the past has been called the dominant tonic gesture, the cadential gesture. Consequently, we don't call it, we don't call it that gesture anymore. I'm waving my hands. You can't see, but I'm waving my hands. Instead, we call it the 5-1. Now, if you make a gesture in 1967 that has the same function, that does the same sort of thing, somebody will say, oh, that's a 5-1, when in fact it's not a 5-1 at all. But since that's what they've been calling it for several hundred years, that's the only thing they know to call it by. And then they transfer its meaning.
Yes.
From the one context to the other.
Yes, I mean, if you would go from a very thick chord, for example, a cluster-type chord, into a thinner chord, there's a gesture of a 5-1.
Resolution.
Of some kind.
Well, there's a question which I guess I'm sort of working toward all along, which I can't really formulate very well. Another way of going at it is going to be to point out that your music is sometimes criticized for being rather limited in scope, i.e. all those piano sounds, all those pianissimo sounds. So that, I don't know, to be flattering, I suppose, as a composer, you're like Emily Dickinson as a poet. In other words, a painter of a restricted palette. The same criticism was leveled at Webern for a long time. And I think people are beginning to stop doing that, finally, because they're beginning to realize that even though the brass always has the mutes on, there's still a lot of other differentiations going on.
Well, you know the Nietzsche remark, the lie of the big form. I think that's a valid criticism. I don't know what they mean by limited palette. Actually, I never really knew what they meant. When it becomes obvious in certain contexts of a certain type of work that the work exists on its own terms, you see.
Well,
it's trying to discuss something on terms that you can't discuss something, on your terms, you see. So when they say about my work that it's a limited palette, then immediately they're thinking about something else.
Yes, but they're not thinking of each work individually. They're thinking of the catalog.
I see.
The composer of, the small sound specialist, the composer of without big climaxes. And then it just seems to me
that the big climax was the first note of the piece.
Yes, it's funny that we finally have got back to this realization that for a long time people thought the climax was in the last movement, late Romanticism. The last movement's the very important thing. And then people began to realize that actually it was a slow movement. The epicenter of the composition is where the climax is. It makes analysis very easy. You simply measure from the end and from the beginning, and when you get to the middle, that's it. And now we're finding out that the climax, the frightening gesture is the first gesture. Once that's done, anything can follow.
Yes, once you enter into the world, someone has been telling lies about Joseph K. Now anything can happen.
Mm-hmm.
So my first note is saying, someone has been telling you lies about music.
Well, except that it's very difficult to defend a position that says that there are lies and there are truths about music.
I'm very moral, you see, in that sense. I'm more moral than my enemies. Because they would listen and they'll be interested in ideas. I don't listen, and I'm not even interested in their ideas. I'm closed.
Well, morally speaking, that seems to me a much more satisfying attitude, because it's not subject to hypocrisy. Anyway, the point remains that it seems to me that if a piece is concerned about doing something and it does it, then that's all you ask of it. You don't ask of well, let's say, Die Fledermaus, that it be Don Giovanni. That's foolish criticism. And there are very few critics left who are subject to this kind of error. Although they do ask of sonatas and interludes, that they be the Hammerklavier. That happens occasionally. And it seems to me that each piece has to find, its own bag and to operate within it. And then by extension, it seems logical to say that this is true of composers. But here the situation breaks down, because then what do you do with somebody like Babbitt, who, it seems to me, has decided that he's going to do something and has gone ahead to do it untiringly, but it just doesn't seem to matter. It doesn't seem to relate. Do you think that there is some kind of necessity for music to relate? Is there a function?
Well, in a sense, that's why I feel much closer, say, to Milton Babbitt than I would to Stockhausen or Babbitt. Because that element of relating is a very easy thing to get. All Milton has to do is put in a vibraphone instead of 4 very arid instruments. Let him put in a vibraphone to relate.
And suddenly he would discover that he was Luigi Dalla Piccola.
Or something or other. And I think it's his marvelous, unyielding palette that makes him a very interesting composer for me. Because I think these other things is just a question to what degree the composer is on the make in relation to his audience, in relation to his reputation.
Well, I hadn't thought of it that way, and that certainly imputes not only an extra musical, but also possibly an injurious attitude to the composer who is, as you say, on the make. And it's easy to think of composers who have been and who haven't been. But what's wrong?
I don't know. I mean, you kind of know. Though I'll tell you, historically, the big on-the-make composers are the one that's made it.
J.S. Bach.
Well, I think that's finished. And I think that for a lot of people, after 10 or 15 years, Milton Babbitt is going to be considered the most important serial composer, without any extracurricular cream puff element.
Yes, but this brings us back to the question of sound, and it brings us back to the question of the 3 operations, composition, performance, and audition, hearing. And when I say related, it seems to me that what you call, the cream puff areas extends to the attitudes that are aroused from the audience by the sounds. Your music, for example, seems to me is very accessible. Very accessible. Anybody can listen to and enjoy Feldman because it has, it is simply beautiful and accessible music, whereas Babbitt's music is inaccessible to the layman because he resists it, in other words. And it's not really a function of the music, it's a function of the person who's listening, whether he's going to resist it or not.
No, I was being unusually, which is unusual for me, more specific. I was relating it to serial music, Babbitt. The whole tenets of serial music. The whole quality, feeling of serial music as being represented by Babbitt and not the more luxurious, opiate Europeans.
Who are abandoning the Babbitt position, which they
abandoning that Weber purity.
Well, how do you differentiate the Babbitt serialism from the Boulez of Structures, Book 1, Serialism, then? I mean, how do you differentiate them? What's the difference between Babbitt's attitude toward total serialization and the early Boulez's attitude?
Well, Structures 1 is much more, it's not as subtle as early Babbitt. It's a kind of rudimentary, follow the, wiped out thing. And coloristically, it's more glamorous just by its instrumentation with the two piano.
That's what I was thinking of, among other things, that there is still a concern with even using as much precomposed schema as possible. There's still a concern with coming out with a late Beethoven sonata, with coming out with, an overpowering effect, which may be based on a succession of movements or on the colors of the instrumentation, or however it's based.
Yes, there was a very literal element, even in relation to the technique in those early Boulez things. And Boulez, in those early days, got a lot of impetus from poetry. The early sonatas were very much involved with Artaud. And then he went on to René Char, and then Mallarmé.
I wonder where he goes next.
Well, being a European, Europeans are very literary. That's European art. European art is literary.
And ours?
It's not. In a sense, I always felt in the sense that I could never understand what all the exciting... I mean, we were really involved in finding some kind of hidden dialectic in the causality of what happens to sound.
Well, now it seems to me that one of the differences between the New York school and the European tradition, already I'm making a big difference, is that the European is concerned with, a literary germinal idea, or the tradition of the music that's been composed, in the past, or systems of aesthetics, whereas the New York school seemed to be less concerned with ingredients of this sort than with process, than with interplay, and I mean this both on the social and on the artistic level.
Yes, you see, the reason my music is limited is because I don't believe in Hegel.
Oh, thank God.
So I'm not looking for another element in which to make my synthesis.
Well, what does this do to with continuation within a piece? How do you get from the beginning of...
If you don't believe in Hegel, how do you write a composition?
Right, yeah.
Because the whole business, we believe in Hegel, like the Soviet Union believed in Hegel when they signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazi Germany. They thought they were going to swallow him up, being that they believed in Hegel. But then they realized that they might be swallowed up.
Since Germany believes in Hegel.
Since Germany believes in Hegel. And it's the same thing when you set up with this multitudinous idea of how you're going to utilize all these things, and eat them up in a gargantuan way in writing a very impressive composition. But if you don't believe in that, then all this other stuff becomes indeed very superficial.
And so when you're sitting down at your drafting table or wherever you write your music, what do you do with the paper? You don't start at the beginning and work through in some Hegelian fashion to an end.
You feel yourself. After all, what is process? Process is how to get the hell out of it. That's process.
Well, of course, the easiest way is simply not to begin. So is there a little bit of Hegel left in everybody who begins?
Yes.
And the difficulty, it seems to me, in choosing not to believe in Hegel is simply the difficulty in getting on with those who still insist on it.
Exactly. If people want my work to be more impressive, they want me to believe in Hegel. That's what it amounts to.
Yeah. And this, of course, comes into every relationship with a conductor or with a critic. And with 9/10 of the audience.
I mean, the most beautiful example, myself at this particular time is not a good example. But I think the most beautiful example is someone like Mondrian. In relation, say, to Picasso.
Well, except that Mondrian is almost in a Weberian position of being very ambiguous, and it would be easy for me to believe that he had a very Hegelian attitude toward filling up his canvas. There's such carefully, or it seems, carefully worked out balance, construction, etc., etc.
It's not worked out, it's felt out.
Oh, then it comes down to a question of intuitive as opposed to knowledgeable Hegelianism.
Yes. Well, the great bit about, say, someone like Picasso, and then we could tie it up with Schoenberg, because if we think, say, for example, is Cubism related? In other words, with what ingenuity can you dissect the rectangle, you see, in relation to what ingenuity can you dissect the scale or the rosette, you see, then where does someone like Mondrian come into the picture? Where the ingenuity is an intuitive process.
Well, now, where you are discounting a Hegelian behavior, all right, I'm getting back to the question of what do you do when you're at the drafting table. It's easy for me to understand how you compose a piece of music, but it's less easy for me to understand how you compose either a long piece of music or a second piece of music. It seems, now, for example, does a long piece require some kind of a formal or structural consideration?
No.
It simply requires that more time pass.
No, I think it requires a sense of scale.
A balance.
No, just the scale, which could be a very intuitive thing. I mean, there's one thing of saying I'm going to work on a 10 by 10 canvas, and another thing, and then trying to fill it up, and another thing, finding that it's becoming a 10 by 10 canvas.
Because something was too big in the first place for its original size.
Yes.
And this happens then also in music.
Yes, in other words, I don't say I'm going to write. I never say to myself I'm going to write an orchestral piece. I never say to myself that I'm going to write a piece.
Sounds big.
But I'm shrewd enough always to start with 20-line paper, you see. So I can catch anything in the net that's happening. And then little by little, you know, we're not that brilliant. We always want to tie things together. We always want to make a package. As soon as you finally settle on an instrumentation, you have a more realistic structure.
And then comes the moment when you realize you absolutely must have an alto flute, in addition to the instrumentation that you'd already decided upon.
Yes. Then you really begin to hear things.
As soon as you rule out a possibility,
So my assumption, and has always been my assumption, is that this need for organizational principle is an intuitive one, which is so strong to begin with. Why burden it with the other? I don't think we have the talent to be, and I don't even think that's advisable that it should be such. I don't think we have the talent to sit down and say, I'm going to write a piece that throughout eternity will never have a sense of organization. Because just the materials that I begin to use will tie it up in the mind and in the ear.
or just the fact that you and only you worked on it.
Exactly. Is the omnipotent organizational process behind the tree, you see.
A couple of years ago, or maybe 1 year ago, Christian Wolff came out here and did a concert together with Robert Moran. And on the program was a composition called The Possibility of a New composition for electric guitar by Morton Feldman. And I was very much charmed by the music. And I said, we recorded the concert, and I said, gee, I'm really happy that the performance went so well because it's a nice piece and we have a tape of it. And Wolf said, well, I don't think that Feldman's finished with the piece. I think that, there are going to be some changes in it, so you'd better not do anything about it until we find out. And we've never found out. Have you ever found out?
No, I never found out.
Maybe it would help if you could hear the tape.
A Christian came to me and he asked for this piece, and... Oh, no, first Christian called me. He lives in Cambridge, he doesn't live in New York. He's a professor of classics at Harvard.
That's right, yeah. I remember
that's how he solves the economic bit.
Yeah. People are getting out of trying to make a living out of music. They do it some other way.
I'm trying to make a living out of music. As I told you, I'm now going to...
You're turning into the enfant terrible of this whole...
I want to make a living out of music.
You're thinking of total serialization?
I think of total serialization. Total serialization without a grid.
Ah, well, that's a different matter altogether.
Who was it that could draw a cycle, a perfect cycle freehand? Who was it? Was it Giotto?
I can't imagine it.
Yes. Who was it? I'll find out this afternoon.
It was probably somebody who lived in the days before they had compasses.
Well, that's my dream. In other words, in relation to... I want to do total serialization freehand.
You mean to compose a piece of music which only upon analysis somebody would prove to you that it was totally serialized?
That's right. I'm only half joking, you understand?
Well, this is not so terribly surprising to anyone who's familiar with your durations and your projections, which are chance pieces. Now, this is very interesting because Boulez has been quoted as saying it's not how something sounds that's important, but how it's made. And you've been quoted as arguing greatly with this.
Yes.
In other words, you want how it's made to be kept a private matter.
Yes, totally.
And how it sounds should be as public as possible, of course.
Only.
Well, then, is this a part of the hang-up with the possibility of a new composition for electric guitar?
Oh, no. Getting back to that story, no, it was just a little in thing. The title of the piece just came from a letter that I wrote back to Christian, telling him that, well, there's a possibility of a new piece for electric guitar.
Well, there actually was a new piece for electric guitar, as it turned out.
It wasn't...
It was heard, by a good many people. Was it written?
Yes, it was written, but he's the only one who has the score. I didn't give it to my publisher, and I don't even have a copy. There's still a possibility that I might write a piece someday for electric guitar.
It's a very fine instrument.
I'm going to like it more and more.
I think it's the vibraphone of the future. Well, that was going to be the next question.
That's always very interesting about music. I think that throughout history, it's only going to have a great past, never a future.
Well, it doesn't even always have a present. At least these days it seems to have a present of some sort.
Because, like a kid, I remember in New York subways, it was always great to stand at the end of the train and watch getting in the station at the last moment by looking backwards.
Yeah.
And to me, that's what music is. There's something about music that is not visionary. As much as people might talk about the music of the future, there's just something about music that only seems to come out of looking backward.
So it'll always be simply a collection of historical necessities.
Exactly.
Well, now this, young composers these days are in a terrible situation because, and I know this is said all the time, but it really seems truer now than at any point in the past. Pretty much everything's been done. The boundaries have been found, not erected, but really sort of discovered. I mean, with the minute you've got 4 minutes and 33 seconds, that takes care of one boundary, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
And so now there seems to be only a possibility of, at least when it comes to styles, an eclecticism.
But it was always like that. I mean, Stravinsky paved the way between joining his neoclassic mode with 12-tone elements, the eclecticism of various serial composers incorporating chants. Consolidation, that's music.
Well, that's what composition means. In
that
the
wasn't. Yes,
analysis.
that wasn't necessarily. You see, it's not my hang-up. My secret is that at a very early life, I became very friendly with a group of painters who were terrific painters. I was caught between two disciplines. And when I would think about music, I would say, why is it you get involved in process and the musician is always an academician? And why is it that the painter gets involved in process and he becomes a Cézanne?
Well, this is, when you're talking about process here, you're talking about compositional procedures,
Yes.
not about process in the Cage-Tudor sense of the word, where the process is the composition. You're talking about the process as distinct from composition. It seems to me a differentiation that's really necessary to maintain.
Yes.
In other words, what you're concerned with, then, I would guess, is that the composer simply allow his music to exist and to examine itself and its surroundings.
Yes.
Halfway, objectively and detachedly, but without a sort of analytical preoccupation in mind. In other words, maintain a procedure which is un-Hegelian. It seems to come back to that.
Yes.
Un-teleological. The idea of a piece of music in which one can wander. Certain places in Mahler, most places in Webern. I think all of your music, all of Cage's music, most of Wolf's music. This is what you wind up with, a sort of garden of sounds.
Yes.
With no path, no paved path which it's necessary to follow.
I wouldn't say that, at least for myself. I would still say that my mind, my instinct is his path.
But as far as I'm concerned, when I hear the piece, I don't know that path. You want to keep the way it's done private and leave only the sound public.
Yes.
And it seems to me, isn't this the reason that you want that? Isn't this the effect that produces, namely that I'm left free to wander without, having the thread to follow about?
Yes, because the thread is that which creates a veil between you and the sound. You see, if I'm anti-process, as you defined it, it's only because, again, on my own terms, being that I'm totally involved in the sound, I don't want anything to interfere with my intention. At the same time, how can I present my work without an intention?
Well, it seems to me that this is a restatement of a remark that you made earlier, that there is no future, that the whole thing will be a collection of backward vistas, not only in the large picture of music as a whole, as a tradition, but in the small picture of a composer at work on each composition or an audience at work on each performance.
Yes.
And even of the connection possibly between the composer and the performer, which is another matter.
Yes. Also, I don't think about art as a kind of living thing. I think about art really as a dead thing that you look back at.
Rather than as a live process in which you become involved.
Yes. I mean, what's the point? It's a very interesting thing, to talk about performances that you heard, and then you hear what happens to it after 15 or 20 years. Or to walk into an all Franz Klein show in 1950 and then just see individual Kleins in various museums, What's that initial experience drops dead. Nothing keeps it alive.
Except that it becomes another piece of art.
Yes. In that sense, the Cagean idea But it's not a kind of simultaneous division. That division takes place in big time gaps. The difference between the work, its performance, and the audience.
Well, we seem to have come full circle, and I can't really think of any reason to add to it. You maintain a complete sense of detachment.
Well,
I mean, to art,
you
to
see,
works of art.
Yes, well, and getting back, what interests me about Milton Babbitt, in a sense, is that I do admire things that are only what they are. And in that sense, I do admire him. Just as I would admire Racine with all its rhetoric, because it's obviously...
That's a part of it.
It is what it is.
Yeah. Well, then it's very difficult not to admire anything.
No, it is... Well, you know, it's like camp when Susan Sontag would talk about, say, a de Gaulle speech as being camp. Only means is that you have to be very shrewd in your assessment what type of rhetoric is authentic.
This is a subject for another discussion someday, because now we're getting into, something that could be called instructions to a young critic, or to a young historian.
Well, I mean, you listen to a piece and you say, oh, gee, that's overblown stuff.
Yeah.
You listen to another piece that's overblown, you don't say it's overblown stuff. What's the difference?
Simply what you bring to your decision.
You're looking at a kind of minimal art and you say, well, this is certainly minimal art. And you look at another minimal art and you say, well, this certainly has an aura about it. What's the difference?
Well, do you think that difference will ever be defined? I've never heard it defined.
Well, that's what separates the boys from the Boy Scouts.